Good evening. I'm Rachel Marston, Associate Director of the Literary Arts Institute at the College of St. Benedict. Welcome to our first reading of the fall semester. Please look at the Literary Arts Institute webpage for information about our other upcoming events. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupied the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nations neighbors. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing award-winning poet Mai Der Vang, whose second book of poetry, Yellow Rain, is the 2021 recipient of the Sister Mariella Gable Prize, a partnership between the Literary Arts Institute and Grey Wolf Press based in Minneapolis. Dante scholar, poet, editor, writer, and champion of new fiction, the late Sister Mariella Gable was an outstanding English professor who taught at the College of St. Benedict from 1928 until 1973. During her long career, she fiercely supported contemporary writing that bravely explored new approaches to style, voice, and content. Mai Der Vang's work exemplifies Sister Mariella Gable's mission. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, Yellow Rain and Afterland, both published by Grey Wolf Press. Afterland was the winner of the 2016 Walt Whitman Award of the Academy of American Poets, longlisted for the 2017 National Book Award in Poetry, and a finalist for the 2018 Kate Tufts Discovery Award. Vang has been a Kundiman Fellow and a Lannan Literary Fellow. She has been published in such places as Poetry, Tin House, the American Poetry Review, and the New York Times. Mai Der also co-edited the book How Do I Begin? Among American Literary Anthology with Among American Writers Circle. She teaches in the MFA program in creative writing at Fresno State. The reading tonight will be followed by a conversation with Mai Der Vang. If you have a question for her, please post it into the chat. Vang's collection, Yellow Rain, is an act of witness, a call for justice, and a lament. The book constellates around Yellow Rain, its impact on the Hmong people, the debates surrounding its origins, while also exploring the Hmong experience during the war in Vietnam and Laos, and in the years of violence, genocide, and diaspora that followed. She writes in the poem Guide for the Channeling that I have been digging within the origins of redaction. Here, Mai Der names one of the primary aims of the book, to take what has not just silenced, but actively erased, to make it visible. In this quote, she also asks us to consider where redaction begins and to what ends redaction is used. She juxtaposes text from declassified government documents with the experiences of the Hmong, whose testimonies about chemical warfare have continually been negated. Her poem, We Can't Confirm Yellow Rain Happened, We Can't Confirm It Didn't, includes 7 epigraphs from various sources, ranging from a CIA report to a toxicologist, all epigraphs including language similar to, neither confirmation nor denial as to exposure to a chemical warfare agent can be made. Early in the body of this poem, Vang writes, expert bounding between what we know and what they've told. We can sell you this much fact. These people, forever canceled out in a perpetual chasm of in-between. Vang's work explores this in-between, the continual waiting and wanting to know, the space between silence and the spoken, the space between the official and the narrative and the what actually happened. She writes in the second to last poem of the book, "It is not to know the shape of what happened, but to know it happened. It happened. It happened. Here I make my light to gaze the trail, then sing this rain threadbare into storm. If love is the sacrament of digging, then here I hold my found into the fire. Let us partake of the sacrament of her digging, embrace this act of love. Please join me in welcoming Mai Der Vang."
Thank you for that introduction. That was so beautiful to hear. Hello, everyone. I hope that you're all having a good day. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us this evening for this reading. And to start, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous lands of the Yokuts and Mono here in Fresno, California, where I live and work, and also where I wrote the bulk of my book, Yellow Rain. I pay my respects to the elders and ancestors, both past, present, and emerging. I'm also very grateful to Rachel Marston, Matthew Harkins, and the Literary Arts Institute of the College of St. Benedict for this invitation to share my work with all of you this evening. Thank you especially for the generous gift of the Sister Mariella Gable Prize, which means so much to me and to this book. And thank you also to Adam Dahl, who's providing some of the much needed technical assistance for tonight's virtual event. And of course, to Grey Wolf Press, my publisher, for making this book available to the public and for believing in the book initially and supporting me through the process of publishing it. So I'm here today to talk to all of you about Yellow Rain, and you may have heard about it, you may know a little bit about it, or you may know nothing about it. When Hmong refugees were fleeing Laos, as my parents were fleeing Laos too at the time, I am a daughter of refugees. I'm daughter of Hmong refugees. When they were escaping, and when Hmong refugees were escaping for their lives through the forests, following the secret war and the U.S. withdrawing from Vietnam and Laos, many of these refugees reported that there was this mysterious substance that would fall from airplanes that would make them sick. And many people died from it. And what happened was that when they arrived into the refugee camps in Thailand and they would tell the camp workers and the doctors about it, no one could make sense of what this mysterious substance was. And so for me, this book is my attempt to reopen the investigation into Yellow Rain, to examine it, and to offer another version. And the first poem I'd like to read is actually the first poem that Rachel read from Guide for the Channeling. And it's the first poem in the book, and is the poem that prepares the reader for what's to come. Guide for the Channeling. Toward a worn legacy of rain, I have been lost down every jungle path, adrift and senseless to split open a cascade of knowing. I have tried with all my limber to keen a credo of justice, shelter those who solace inside graves. I have been boiled in my bladed search, opening with questions of a deserted pain to end with a cemented breath shattered into silk. This is where I am taking you, into a discarded vista blowing forth a silent blaze. Here in sunk villages of the disregarded, here where even the dirt of the land cannot muster against the threat of air. Biomedical vegetation, munitions unfound, every footprint incarnate. Where highlands tangle their echoes to the ground, a place no matter how remote will always be too near and too much a reminder of an expired war. Refugees not called as people only to be called the outcome of an event. We are venturing into swell beyond swelling of paperwork and protocol, slips of memo and routing, cable and classified meeting. Here is the talk. Biological weapon, yellow spots, apiary blame for decades to wane and cold filed. Believe me as a torch of this wandering that I have been digging within the origins of redaction. Believe where I am sending you. I have been shoveling upside down, and now my eyes stagger, my hands ache, my legs becoming hunter, my back a raging shadow. I have been gardening myself into this remembrance. So, this next poem that I want to read, there's an epigraph that I won't read the whole epigraph, but I'll read sort of an excerpt from it. And when I was doing a lot of the research for this book, it was just and I came across this particular epigraph that I'm going to read to all of you. It was just so startling to me, and so painful to even consider the possibility of something like this. A daub of tree swallows as aerial ash. Most serious charge, however, relates to report of massacre committed on May 15th, 1985, in which approximately 5,000 civilians were ordered into a cave and were gassed. Some 25 intended victims reportedly escaped being driven into the cave. Our efforts to date do not enable us to confirm any details of this incident. Cable from the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok to the Secretary of State, September 3rd, 1985. All over threnodies of dissected water inside this cavern of scars. Had the bar now been more accepting to tell, had your sonatas pedaled from below the walls of this resounding abyss, questioning what yielded in your conduit of husk, they cannot be sure of details in preference to dismiss in fear of the knives sewn into their bones. They offer no place for you, but here is a place to rest your evening birdsong, alongside a river of windows, under a trellis of bells, to nourish in silk leaves and a harvest of wild pears. So, I'll get to some more poems, but I also want to just add some more context as to Yellow Rain, and especially for those of you who are learning about it for the first time. So as time went on, more people began to talk about this yellow rain substance, or this chemi, as it was referred to by some of the Hmong refugees. And because of the frequency and the rise in the number of reports, the US government began to take interest in this thing. And they conducted what would become a very confusing 8-year investigation into yellow rain. And it wasn't just the US government, but there were other governments around the world who also began to take an interest in yellow rain. And the question was, if this really was a biological weapon, then who was the perpetrator? One thing that you have to keep in mind too is that all of this was happening during the Cold War, at a very tense political time when the US was at odds with the Soviet Union. And so there were also various treaties in place to prevent the use and proliferation of these weapons. So the point of this investigation was to figure out who was to blame, right? And in the case of the United States, they pointed the finger at the Soviet Union, who they accused of providing this, mysterious yellow rain substance to the communists in Southeast Asia to use against the Hmong people. And as it happens, one of the key components of the investigation were the thousands of blood and vegetation and clothing samples that were provided by Hmong refugees. And what I find to be really heartbreaking about the giving of all of these samples was that even though they were given in the hope that they were going to help find out what yellow rain was, it was almost futile because as soon as you shipped these samples around the world, they already began to degrade, and it was very hard to identify after the fact. There were also cases of poor packaging, and things just getting lost in transit. There were just a ton of logistical barriers in the investigation, and that was something that really bothered me. And how can we know what yellow rain is when we think about all of the logistical barriers to even figuring out what it was? How can anyone say that it's this or that? How can anyone even negate it when it could very much be a biological weapon? And this was something I learned when I did my research. I came across a dissertation by Dr. Rebecca Katz, who provides the very convincing argument that yes, that this was a toxin and that it was used against the Hmong people. So a lot of context there, but I think it helps with these next few poems that I want to read for all of you. This poem, the next one, looks into the investigation and the giving of these samples. Request for furthermore. We are nowhere near deduction. Further from conclusion, coming up void, please collect new blood and urine samples, taught with higher harm to be ionized into staggered lies. Match age, sex, general state of health, and diet history of each individual with that of a control. Give us anything you can. Collect samples of any traditional or herbal medicines. Give us dietary samples, clan labels, the accent they share with roosters. Give us the placentas they give to their gods. We really need control samples from the refugee population. Objects fermented, peppers of the sunset meal, granules of catalyst mold. Clothing samples are urgently needed. Try to match to best of your ability the degree of wear of the item. Ragged textures bolting unkempt, the man wearing 2 shirts as well. Give us the shirt underneath. Archive of rare clouds. We need a collage, credible ephemera. At your discretion, a loop of hair, tendon of embedded aloe, wept hugs inside a thimble. Please send medical records, results of any diagnostic tests, blood workups, physician notes, in short, anything that will provide additional details on the individual's physical condition. Any of these conditions, unsterile ennui, a cloned delusion of relief, pain of the instinct to flee, hollowness, plight of wounded movement. We are particularly interested in whether or not skin lesions have developed. Please consider we are asking for conundrums. Consider our backlog a scrapbook of scattered strangers. We are overwhelmed, falling through in vain from the fever of this work, in need of more giving. Whatever to uphold, we've unlocked the lion's coffer. Whatever to gorge from the kill in its gut. This next poem I want to read looks into the issues around trying to fund this investigation and how the lack of funding impacted the ability for investigators to actually even find out what yellow rain was. And again, this one has a couple of epigraphs, but I'm going to just read just a short excerpt from that first epigraph. Disfigures. The delay in funding is having a serious negative effect on the team's substantive work. Over the past 5 months, the team has been functioning by bleeding other mission elements for transportation, vehicles, and secretary support. Cable from the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok to the Secretary of State, March 2nd, 1984. It's about the money. It's not about the money. It's about politics. It's not about the politics. It's about budget restraints. It's not about budget restraints. It's about proving yellow rain. It's about disproving yellow rain. It's about men and their need for more arms. It's about men and their need to repurpose arms. It's about men and their need to shore up. It's about concocting the reason to shore up. It's about dismantling the reason to shore up. It's about leveraging the Hmong story of yellow rain. It's about rejecting the Hmong story of yellow rain as lies. It's about routing blood samples in a timely manner. It's about misrouting, delays, loss of sample integrity. It's about taking down the Soviets. It's about defending the Soviets. It's about violating treaties. It's about ignoring violations. It's about how to grade compliance of treaties. It's about the facade of compliance. More than prototyping means of sabotage, experimentation of new concealments. It's about the footprint of bees, collectors of a pearled stalk unable to send their wings into bloom. It's about a face no longer to wake, a disheveled neck staring through the satin of its own shadow. It's about a shroud of guilt, theaters of espionage to sour and scandalize, cider of the sun. It's about the money, the currency of a body, the body as a form of currency. It's about buildup, a collection of stiff bodies in a cemetery of debt. Okay, so as the investigation continued, there was a scientist who discovered very suspicious levels of this substance called trichothecene mycotoxin on a leaf. And from that, the US government began to build its case. In many ways, the government wanted to be able to argue that yellow rain was a biological weapon and that the Soviets were culpable, because an argument like this would help those in government who favored increased arms control. And this meant they could essentially exploit or leverage the Hmong story of yellow rain to argue that Congress needed to focus more spending on defense, on weapons and bombs. But then there were also those within government, and especially within the scientific community, led by a professor named Dr. Matthew Meselson at Harvard, who had a very different agenda and a very different approach. And it seems to me that the agenda from his angle was to prevent the proliferation of weapons in the world, with a focus toward disarming the world. And so his view seemed very much at odds with those who wanted to argue that yellow rain was this biological weapon. And so Dr. Meselson proposed that what had been thought of as a biological weapon was actually just the fecal matter of bees defecating in large swarms. In other words, they said it was just bee poop, this yellow rain substance, right? And they also said Hmong people just didn't know any better. Their concern was that if yellow rain really was a biological weapon, then it could potentially escalate tensions around the world. And so it just, in my mind, it just seemed more convenient to say Hmong people lied. Yellow rain isn't a weapon, it's just bee poop. Get on with your life or move on, That was sort of the tone of that moment. And while the two sides in government bickered over their political agendas, the Hmong people were just stuck in the middle. And it's as if no one really cared what would happen to the Hmong people. And so the next two poems that I want to share is just me thinking into the bee feces theory. Okay. The culpable. When all else fails, you'll indict the bees. When all else rushes at your awareness in the stage of sudden bees, you'll second guess if it had been the bees. You'll claim the moonlight betrayed you to know and see anything, but only with a knife. When all else relents and you are kneeled for an answer, you'll go back to spying on the bees, censoring their course the way you faulted us into outlaws, caught between hopeless and hopelessness, doubting us in the throat of your blame, saying malice to the grass, saying bees sired the venom that sired our lies that could sire another war. What fate tilted in your favor? Counter the weight back to us. What fate tilted in your favor? Counter the weight back to bees. Okay, so I think I'm going to do two more poems here. This one is called Of the Ash. And for me, I think so much of the work that I've done, especially with this book and also with my first book, Afterland, was just, really sort of going back to revisit and in some ways resurrect the secret war, the war that for many Hmong refugees and Hmong Americans and children of Hmong refugees is still something that lingers in the back of our minds, in our sense of in the sense of who we are, the sense of being Hmong. The secret war is just continuing always there in the back of everything that we do in some ways, at least for me. Of the Ash. One more stint of soaring turns the starling marvels nightward. One circus of alloyed men as spectators whose every pin song and wick is gridded. When there are alarms to outlast all the others, they'll know that homeland is the heart's name for halcyon. They'll filter a nightmare as the middle of all waiting for mold that grows inside their dreams, summoned by mint. They sob for brightness that harpoons the migrating drowse, how it downs into their tincture of awareness, what they know of experience. Clandestine is to let oneself be imagined by the dust. If the reason to leave had been falling, they'll die deprived of a roof to their name, without nacre to ask if there had been no war to lose. So I started doing the research for this book, Yellow Rain, almost a decade ago, and most of that consisted of digging through archival material, declassified documents, and government reports. And as I was sharing earlier, this book is my attempt to remember what's happened and to do the best that I could do to try to reopen, to resurrect this investigation, to shed more light on it, to offer a counter narrative, and also to offer a public and poetic reckoning of its aftermath in some ways, and using poetry as the medium from which to be able to retell a different version of the event. So the last poem I want to read for all of you is a poem that appears toward the end of the book. It's a little longer piece, but this is a poem to me that I think captures what I want to offer my readers about Yellow Rain. Manifesto of a Drum. Predator I've become for a truth and fainted tower. If it means when I turn to cut the ache in my spine, instead I find your bitter teeth. Melt your crown to amend a bayonet for my seeking. Trophy yourself, purveyor of peace, fathering out schemes, post-eagle partisan arms, doldrums of the fatigued, no filament for retreat. Even with my sight sealed and my back turned, I am not without mystic voltage, nor a battalion of the dead, never distant from the mantle of my kin. Billowed and glinted as a fixture into fluttering, in-flight lung vertigos, etheric mage of the molecular dream, a candescent garden aglow from precipitation to wall. Lapis lazuli rising to my sea, self-chariot in a cyclone of ink. Carry me as I have carried you. Show me where to look, as I have shown you through the burning of Joss and its divination. Show me how jaded the burden lives, yellow rain as abduction of a wound, for the matter of shock magnified, toward a new coffer of bombs. Someone dies for another to live. How bent and never erstwhile this becomes my being. If to sculpt from fog a child of swords, pronounce question marks on a beloved's face, my flooded cup, if it wails and grows thin, trails the tenor of wind. For as long as a Saula can flee, I have been brooding in my sleep, moving through a century of leaves. A voice out of scrying, a river shifting my ears. Some early mornings are left for listening to water tones lilting the banks of a primeval lake, but the lake has been lacquered into the stars, mirroring its clotted hand down to mine. What does it take to raise an answer from the grave? Quantify stillness of doubt through unmarked bodies becoming ciphers for loss. I gather sharpness of my burn beyond agony for an answer. It is not to know the shape of what happened, but to know it happened, it happened, it happened. Here I make my light to gaze the trail, then sing this rain threadbare into storm. If love is the sacrament of digging, then here I hold my found into fire. Thank you all so very much for listening and for being here again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was amazing to get to hear you read from the book, as well as the context you're helping provide for all of us, and especially those who may not yet have had the opportunity to buy the book. I'll do a plug for on Mai Der Vang's behalf. Buy the book; it's amazing. So you can find it easily through online bookshops and likely in our campus bookstores as well. You. Well, we have an initial question from the audience, and then I have some questions prepared too. But one of our first questions is how did you become interested in poetry?
Yeah, thank you for that question. How did I become interested in poetry? I grew up my being a daughter of refugees, I grew up in a traditional refugee family, and my parents were resettled actually in the Twin Cities in the very early 80s. And I was born right about the time that they resettled here. So right at the cusp of leaving the refugee camps and then resettling in the United States, and having to start their life over again. And growing up, I sort of did a lot of the things that would require me to help my parents to communicate, to navigate just everyday tasks, and through that process, I just was able to develop a proficiency for English, and was able to also do a lot of writing. As a child, I spent my summers reading books, and I also loved going to libraries. It was such a great concept. Like, the library is a great concept. It's a place where you can go get books and you can take them home. And that was a really exciting thing for me as a child. And then also growing up too, I was very lucky to have some amazing English teachers who just really nurtured this love for poetry, and just a way to sort of think about poetry not as this daunting thing, but to be able to just enjoy what you could do with language. And so this is a very long response to saying, how did I become interested? But I think that so many things allowed me to develop that interest. I didn't really start writing poems actively maybe until like I was 10 or 11 years old. And I tell this to everyone because I think it's important for people to know that I started out writing poems that were roses are red, violets are blue, you're so cute and I like you. I mean, come on, like that's that's where I was able to begin accessing the basics of language. And so yeah, I wrote a lot of poems to friends too as a child. So that's sort of how I became interested in poetry. Also, just knowing that I came from a family where English was not English is not something that we spoke every day. And so to be able to access English in the way that I was allowed for me to really help my parents out. And that, again, just developed into a lifelong love for poetry.
Well, and I was thinking as you were talking about this, both the challenge of being a young child translating for your parents, but also the way in which occupying this multivocality that is very present in your work too, right? Which is also tied to, I would imagine, to being multilingual, and even then the power of poetry of metaphor, right? Which is that often when you're trying to communicate between languages, that metaphor becomes a very powerful way to do so. And so and thinking about in your book the ways in which you keep thinking about these modes of communication, right? So and I see we have a number of questions coming in from but a question that I had for you was, clearly poetry is invested, but what in particular do you think poetry allowed you to do in exploring the topic of yellow rain that another form may not have allowed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and for me, it's something that I still think about that too, like how I found myself in poetry to be able to write this book and to talk about yellow rain. I think one of the most amazing and beautiful things that poetry can allow for is that when you're writing a poem, there's a kind of emotional truth that can come out of that poem, right? Even if you're not writing a poem that's factual or like all of it is supposed to be accurate, even if it's like, you know, about the fact that, you might live in outer space, or you really connect with stars or something like that. You see stars as sentient beings or something like that. It's the emotional truth that comes through, I think, in every poem that poets write, or tries to come out, right? Is the ability to be able to get closer and closer and closer to the thing that's hard to say. And that's what I love with poetry. And I think for this book particularly, I was able to experiment with various styles and techniques and craft approaches to think about, how am I going to offer this to my reader? How am I going to try to sort of to convey this narrative of Yellow Rain in a way that not only tells the story of Yellow Rain, but also allows for my craft and poetry integrity to also come through. And so for me, I think there's so much dexterity with what poetry can do. One of the things that I really enjoy about poetry is listening to the sounds of words and seeing how those words resonate off of other words, and paying attention to cadences. And so for me, I really enjoyed being able to do that with a lot of the poems in this collection, to be able to break through the silences of Yellow Rain, but to also then like create moments of silence too in the book around Yellow Rain. So maybe that's one example, but I see there are other questions coming in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, one that I think we want to make sure to address is a fairly straightforward one. What is the full title of the book? Just so people know.
Yeah. The full title is Yellow Rain Poems, right?
Yeah. But we just want to make sure people, can know.
Absolutely.
One of the next questions ties into something that we were thinking about already. And the audience member asked, could you talk a little bit about how poetry might be a particularly appropriate genre for countering official government narratives?
Yeah, I think that kind of ties into what the last question that you asked me around the way that with poetry, in my mind, I feel like it gets me closer and closer to some kind of truth, whether it's the truth of the poem or the truth of the thing that I'm writing about, or whether it's my emotional truth coming out. There's something that comes out that other, if you hadn't written the poem, it otherwise wouldn't have come out in whatever way it's coming out. And I think as it relates to sort of countering official government narratives, I've seen just, and I wouldn't even say that it's a new thing. It's poets have been doing this for a very long time. I'm thinking about the work of Muriel Rukeyser, who has been doing this kind of work too. But there's just been this really exciting momentum around documentary poetics or docu poetry docu poetics, and for me, like I feel like for me, taking a lot of the government documents wasn't really just a way to be able to reclaim the spaces of those documents for this book, but it was also a chance to offer a counter narrative, to be able to speak back against it, and to give a version that the government at the time was just not able to sort of offer, or had completely neglected, or that was just not part of the discourse. I feel like the Hmong perspective got so lost in the political chaos of Yellow Rain, and so there has to be a space that gets created, I think, to be able to reoffer that narrative, and poetry for me is that space. If you've seen the book, there are things that I've done in the book that I've never done in other poems. And that's what's exciting, is that with poetry, like, you can do things that terrifies you. You can do things that maybe you've seen other people do and it makes you a little nervous. And so that's what I did. I feel that I can do that with poetry in ways that I can't do with prose.
Well, and I think it's particularly evident, and again, recognizing that some of our audience may not have seen any of the texts, but in what we might say are more traditionally formatted poems, right? While not necessarily working in specific poetic forms such as the sonnet or things like that, but that are working in more standard stanzas, but you can see the italicized language that you bring in. But then you also have, for example, in the composition sections, where you take this language and you're really using text as image as well as text, and collaging it to create this, I think, these incredibly powerful things that often are overlapping text, even for me really signaled these competing narratives and the difficulty of, like, well, wait, like, what it should be being focused on here, right? It's the experience of the people who were harmed.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the collages, because those were, when I was writing these poems, I could have never expected that I was going to be including this. And it really kind of comes down to the fact that there's just so much that I accumulated through the process of the research, and there like, so much of what's offered in those collages are sort of other glimpses into the matter of Yellow Rain that aren't offered in the poems themselves. And so and the work of sort of assembling and curating a lot of that language was something that I thought really carefully about. They definitely, for me, I'm glad that they're in there. I'm glad that they're there to be able to sort of give other snippets into the issue of Yellow Rain. Otherwise, I could have written more poems, but I feel like the collages allow for a little bit of break from the poems too, and allows the reader to be able to just see what I was immersed in, all the language I was immersed in.
Yes, absolutely. Another question from the audience we have is, were you able to speak to many of the refugees whose experiences inspired the book? And if so, how much of an influence did that play in your storytelling?
Yeah, that's a great question, because for me, I think some of the most, like, immediate folks that I thought about talking to were obviously my own parents and my relatives, and it's in some ways it's such still a thing that has to be handled with care, and in the sense that I'm not just going to go and, like, reopen that for all of them, right? Or reopen the grief of that experience. But what I do know in sort of just the sharings, the personal sharings, the sort of the intimate moments of just sharing and offering that history, is that many elders talk about the fact that they believed that this was a toxic thing. This was something that was inflicted upon a lot of the refugees during that time. And some refugees were lucky to not have to go through the experience of yellow rain, whereas others had to experience it and heard stories about it. And when they were in the camps, they, recalled people talking about it, but it was always kind of like a hush hush thing, right? People were afraid for their lives, so no one was going to just openly start, saying there's this chemical substance floating around, this. So people, there was a kind of discretion that you had to exercise when you talked about some of these things. I I also pulled a lot of information from the testimonies that were collected by the government, and I obtained a lot of that through the archival research. And so there's actually a whole composition, the first composition, in fact, that includes just documented experience after experience after experience of the attacks. And that, to me, when I encountered that, was just it was very heavy to take in, all of that information and regarding the attacks. So yeah, I'm just kind of using my discretion about how to approach this with elders was really important. And then I've also connected with Kao Kalia Yang, who, if you're aware of what happened with Radiolab, it was a very painful experience to have to sit through that interview for her and her uncle. And so, I've had the chance to connect with her, and she's, reached out. I actually did a reading with her the other week, which was really great to be in conversation with her. But to be able to connect with people has just been really interesting. And then I also started getting comments on Facebook, too. People saying, "Thank you for writing this book. My dad used to talk about yellow rain, and we had relatives who died from it." And that sort of just really kind of sets things into a different perspective. So yeah, I hope that answers the question about speaking to people.
No, absolutely. And I think it also speaks to the real heart of the project too, with this importance of opening up a space, as you were saying, to speak into this silence, to especially allow for the Hmong perspective to be told and shared. One of the other questions that I think ties into what we've already been discussing is someone from the audience asked, what came out of the government's investigation? Do they still believe Hmong people were lying about their experiences with this substance? What have been the repercussions of this assumption?
Yeah, so the government at the very end of this 8-year confusing, chaotic investigation declared that they couldn't make an argument for or against it. And so the government stood there, even though the most of the leaning tends to be toward the belief that it is and was a biological weapon. So that's the government. But the counter argument, which is actually the argument around the bee feces theory, that's actually the argument that is widely accepted, more so than this other perspective that I'm trying to offer. And so that's actually where it stands now, is just that yellow rain was just bee feces. Then there are other sources that say yellow rain is still a mystery. We don't know what it even is. So it's hard to live in that kind of space where all these multiple sources are saying, yes, it is a biological weapon. No, it's not a biological weapon. Well, actually, we don't even know what it is. And that creates, just it sort of removes this sense of agency for any Hmong person who may have lost people to yellow rain. And erases that sense of trauma. And so that's what I find to be also really heartbreaking through all of this. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And since we were speaking about talking to, for those who haven't had a chance to listen to the Radio Lab episode from 2012 on yellow rain, It is hard to listen to, but it is worth listening to, and then as well as reading a lot of the text around it, especially Yang's response to the episode, because it does really speak to this. I mean, what she ends up calling, well, this becomes a semantic debate that, as you were just saying, erases the pain of those who experience this or lost loved ones in
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah, and I'll just also quickly add to that too, that just the Radio Lab experience, like going back to the question of whether or not I was able to speak to refugees about their experiences with Yellow Rain. I feel very protective, given the experience that that Kalia had with her uncle on that Radio Lab episode. I feel so protective of my elders, and just like this book is not a space to like force the elders to relive that trauma, but because I feel like that there's a need to sort of create a space for them to sort of remember it in a way that honors the stories and the experiences and the testimonies, but not to do it not to sort of publicize that in a book. And so for me, like thinking back to that Radio Lab episode, I feel protective of elders who have gone through it, and I don't know if I'm interested in just putting them out there, to be pained again. But that's what it reminded me of when you were just talking about Radio Lab right now, because it is painful, right? It was a painful
Yes.
thing to hear. Yeah.
And how do you, I think, then balance informing a wider population and also the exploration of your own sense of loss and dislocation because of this uncertainty?
Yeah. Well, so for me, I think that I focused heavily on the research, on looking through the archives and the declassified documents, because I was really interested in sort of deconstructing and looking at the bee feces theory. I was also really interested in trying to understand the political implications of the Cold War and how that obviously had an impact on the way that Yellow Rain would play out internationally. And so those were some of the things that I considered when I was writing a lot of these poems and composing my thoughts around Yellow Rain. The testimonies are there, the symptoms and the things that the impacts that were felt by a lot of the Hmong refugees are also there in the book. But for me, I think that one thing I wanted to also bring to the discourse on Yellow Rain was just how so much of the political climate was impacting people's ability to sort of understand it, and how within all of that, the Hmong story just got lost in all of the Cold War, this side, that side, disarmament, weapons defense, congressional spending, all of that. And so I feel like that was just devastating for me to think through, that in the end we were kind of thought of as pawns to some degree, to be leveraged, to be exploited in that regard. Yeah.
Yes, towards one side or the other's political ends.
Right.
A question we have from the audience is, what is something that you would have wanted to add into the book after you finished it? Or is there something that you've been thinking about since it's been published that you're like, oh, if I could go back, I would add this thing in?
Yeah, honestly, so much of what's there is like there's already so much there, and I don't know that I would add more. In fact, I was working with Jeff Schatz, who's my editor, and we cut some stuff out, and I, reasonably so, because it became quite the project, and so I want to believe that what I have provided is to the best of my ability, and that everything that I've provided in the book is again part of the answer to what I believe Yellow Rain was focused on and was about. So, yeah, maybe I won't add anything if that's okay.
Yes, no,
But
that's fine.
that's a great question. Maybe I would add other stuff for my first book, but maybe with this one, I think it's already thick enough.
Right, you like it feels like there's enough
Right, yeah.
in there. I mean, maybe not enough, but that it is sort of it is complete into
It
what you were
feels
intending to
right
do.
to the best of my ability, yes. Yeah.
Another question that we have from the audience is asking about your writing process. So, what is your writing process typically for writing poems like the ones in your book?
Yeah, so for this collection, I because of the extensive research that I did for the book. I mean, like I said earlier, I spent almost nearly a decade doing the research, and then spent years writing the poems too. I had to really be organized first of all, because I accumulated multiple binders of paperwork, and I printed stuff out so that I could really experience these documents as they were meant to be experienced. And so for me, the process was such that I spent years just reading through a lot of these documents. Like there were summers where I would just read, I mean, for fun, right? But I would just really spend my time immersing myself within the language, within, all of the acronyms that I had to learn, within how to like sort of interpret a cable, and figure out what the routing all meant in it. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. I also spent a lot of time learning about bees, and I also, you know, looked into other topics and subject matter area as well. And then it wasn't until I finally felt that I had some footing within the research that I could then begin to weave out the skeleton of the collection. And I knew, okay, this is what I want to also say. I want to write a poem that addresses this. I also want to make sure I include a poem on this. And so for me, that was the process where I spent years first reading the documents, really kind of categorizing them and figuring out which ones I felt had poetry potential. And then and that was also part of that counter narrative that I was trying to tell. And then being able to write the poems in the final years. Yeah. So yeah, really separating it out helped me stay sane at least. Yeah.
Yes. Did you find it hard after going down what some other friends and I often call the research rabbit hole, right? Like you can get into the research, like
Oh
to come
yeah.
out of that to start doing the writing.
Absolutely, absolutely. There were days where I would read something in a document and then I would be, oh, that's fascinating. And then I would spend that day on that thing. And then it would lead me to another thing. It was sort of just like a chain reaction of investigation. But it was also really exciting because for me, it was like these are things that helped to sort of expand my thinking. And I went into this thinking that I was just going to be researching Yellow Rain when in fact I learned so much about everything else too in the process. And yeah, you're right. It does kind of take you there. And then finally, when I was ready to write the poems, that's when I had to put the documents away, right? Or maybe I was just working with one document in that particular moment, or I was just working with a passage or an excerpt from that document. That was sort of the thing that grounded the poem. And that was really helpful to kind of think of my process in that way.
Thank you so much. I'm just observing our time. So I just want to thank you again for your amazing work, for coming and being with us tonight and joining me in conversation, and for our audience for the great questions and your attention. We'd also like to thank Grey Wolf Press for partnering on the Sister Mariella Gable Prize and helping bring such amazing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction into our world, to help in the support you provide for authors, as well as to the Manitou Fund, which is one of our supporters for our reading series and for the Sister Mariella Gable Prize. Again, thank you to our audience for being here tonight. Our next event will be on Tuesday, November 3rd with Keith Lamont. Have a great night, and we look forward to seeing you then.